So here, I'll tell you this funny story. Like when I first started doing this work and that thing I was telling you about stratospheres, I had written about 60 pages on stratospheres. And then I wrote about how to have less stress. So I showed it to my brother, and the world bros my brother a favor, right? And he goes, "What? I'm not going to read 60 pages on this crap and then try to figure out how to have less stress. What are you nuts?" I'm like, "Oh, okay." So then it went down to a chapter, then it got down to 2 pages. Now it's an
Wow.
appendix in the book, but it's in there, right? Because to me, that's the earth-shaking changes in this book. But yeah, so I had to include it, but it's in the back of the book, so you don't even have to read it if you don't want to. So
Mm, I think in this case, I think there will be people, some percentage of people who are going to be very interested in that specifically, but
yes,
the general
absolutely,
population will be only interested in how can I apply this. And
yes,
so I
that's
think
exactly right.
mm, you can still, especially like for me, like that might be very fascinating, right? Like I love philosophy, I love neuroscience. I'm like I'm nerding out on that stuff a lot of the times, but I know like I know if I write a book on about all of that, like the people who I want to help, they will start reading it. They're like, "What is this jargon? I can't understand any of it." I'm bye,
Yes,
you know.
exactly.
So
Yeah, that's
if
exactly.
we want to make it very practical, it needs to be short, to the point, and very practical.
Well, that's exactly what I was trying to accomplish because as a primary care doctor, I'm used to taking very complicated medical information and digesting it and giving it to you that and making it personal to you, right? So that's what I'm trying to do here, which I'm taking these very complicated concepts, but I'm making it so you can understand it. The problem I get into with a book is that I have to write it generically. Like I can't, I don't
Mm,
know who, I don't know who the reader is because I don't know what your individual story is. So I just have to write it in the general population can understand it. So that's why I like to do seminars and do one-on-one stuff because then I can go, okay, here's the book, but I'm going to personalize it to you, and that's where the real strength comes from.
yeah, absolutely. I want to highlight one concept or one thing that you spoke about earlier a little bit, and that was that many people knew, oh, I just want to stress less. I just don't want to stress anymore, but they didn't know the opposite of that, or like what's on the other side, right? And I think
Yeah,
I've seen that many times, and I've heard about it many times from other doctors and coaches and educators, that many people just get stuck in, I, they know what they don't want, but if you ask them what
yeah,
they want, they don't know. And I think that's a
yeah.
very
Well,
important
neither did I.
first step.
Here's the stupid thing. Neither did I. I'm writing this whole book on how to have less stress, and I had left out I was so busy on stratospheres and how to reduce your stresses and the side effects and writing highway to your happy place roadmap. It's like I didn't, I did, it came, it was when after I started asking the question, where would you be? And realizing people didn't know that I was like, oh, well, I need to figure this out before I write this book. So the happy place, here's the rooms that I put in there, right? So the first room is contentment. So
Mm,
contentment is sort of like this baseline level of how you feel at any given moment. And it's pretty consistent. So I liken it to a paycheck. So you go to work and you get a paycheck. You work 40 hours and that's your contentment, right?
mm,
So some people are really contented because they have like a good paycheck. Other people are not so contented because they don't have a good paycheck. But it's sort of a baseline. There's right. So your contentment might go up a little bit because you get a raise, or it might go down a little bit because you work less hours that week, whatever. But in general, there's a baseline to your feelings, and it's a combination of good things that are going on in your life and bad things that are going on in life, and it comes out to this level. Your perceptions can change that, so you can be in a miserable setting and still be happy depending on your perspective. So you can change that. So there's another book that I was involved in called Mindset Matters. And that's where that book comes in and says, hey, you know what? You can change your situation just by looking at it differently. You don't even have to change. You don't have to do anything physically. Just by looking at it different, it can change. The second room is what I call pleasure slash fun slash love, which are these blips. So your level of contentment is kind of at a baseline, but then you get a bonus at work and you're like, whoa, and you're like, your pleasure center goes off. And you're like, yeah, that's really cool. That's exciting. Yay, it's so good. But then over time, it kind of wears back down and you go back. So if you go on vacation, you're like, oh, that's exciting. And then, you get back from vacation, go back to work, and you're back to your level of contentment. So pleasure by definition kind of comes and goes. Then the third category, the third room, is anticipation of pleasure. So my
Mm.
wife and I are getting ready to go on a cruise to Australia and New Zealand, and we're like super excited about it. So my wife's like, 41 days, and you're like, what? Right? So we're using that skill of envisioning the future, and now I'm excited about this vacation, and I can get all this pleasurable sensations. And I haven't even gone yet. How cool is that? And in my imagination, the vacation is going to go perfect. All my luggage is going to show up. The ship's going to be great. Nobody's going to get sick. All the things that we do are going to be awesome. So I get months of thinking about how good that's going to be, right? The next one is gratitude. And this is one, it's interesting. We talk about this a lot, like you should be grateful. But I think people don't realize how grateful we should be. So I have what I call the 50-point wake up.
Mm.
So the 50-point wake up is I wake up, my eyes open up, and I get 10 points because I'm still alive. Then I get 10 points because my wife's still alive. Then I get 10 points because there's water in my house. 10 points because there's food. And 10 points because I can have an indoor toilet. Yay. Okay, so 50 points just by opening my eyes. Now, how freaking cool is that, right?
Mm.
It's don't understand how good we have. I was in Germany and we went to a castle, and it was this beautiful castle, Neuschwanstein, if you've ever been there. And but I'm like realizing like this is like this guy had to walk up 4 or 5 flights of stairs because they didn't have elevators in those days. They didn't have air conditioning. Their heat was from a log, right? I mean, it's like which was okay, but it wasn't that great. And it's like he had some nice privileges, but my life is better than his, right? We don't understand how good we have it right now. There is a tendency for humans to tend to be negative about what's going on. And I was like this. I was talking to an older physician and he'd been around in the 50s, and I was like, "Yeah, things aren't so great now." He goes, "What? Are you nuts? Like it wasn't that long ago that we didn't have antibiotics. So think about this. There was a whole bunch of people that died of strep throat. Why? Because they didn't, or died of an infection in their skin, or died like what? Like because we didn't have antibiotics. Do you know how many people are alive now because they just took a week of penicillin? They're like, what? So we have to really learn to have gratitude. And when you have gratitude, it's really hard to be angry and mad at people because you're feeling so grateful. The next category is what I call fulfillment, and it's made up of three things. So the first one is learning. So humans are incredibly curious, and it's built into us. Like we are an organism that is an omnivore, so we have to run around our environment to find things to eat. And so we're built to be curious. And so learning is just using that curiosity to increase your knowledge. Second is giving. And so we live in a communal organism. We're a communal organism. And so in that community, it's built into us to say, hey, I want to be nice to everybody in my group. So giving to the group is built into us. So all we have to do now is make our group bigger. So instead of saying my group is my family or my group is my community, now we just have to say, hey, my group is humans, right? And then giving becomes an automatic pleasurable activity. And the last one is fulfillment. And fulfillment is really, I mean, excuse me, is purpose, and that we need a purpose in our life. And I was just reading this book by Og Mondino, and what he talks about is you need something that you're enthusiastic about. Like you wake up in the morning and go, yeah, I want to do that. You're jazzed up about it. And when you can find that, yeah, then you're in a really good place. If you don't have that, life becomes a drudgery. And it's not that hard to find. There's a Japanese term called ikigai. And I learned this from another podcaster. And you make these four circles and you go, okay, what am I good at? What do I like to do? What can I make some money at? And what's good for my community, whatever size your community is. And where those things intersect, that's your ikigai. And that becomes your purpose. That becomes the thing that you get enthusiastic about. So for me, I've gone from being enthusiastic about being a doctor and helping people to now being an author and helping people just in a different way. But I'm really enthusiastic. So when I wake up in the morning and I get to be on Audra's podcast, that's like, yeah, this is exciting stuff. Because what I find is there's way too many people out there that go, I'm just stuck. I'm resigned. I just have to live my life stressed out. There's nothing I can do about it. And I'm like, no, there's lots
Yeah.
of things you can do about it. You just have to take the effort. And that's where that when I was telling you about that integrated family systems, this is where I pulled it into my own work. And you might want to use this yourself. I realized that people have parts. So some part of them is like, oh, I hate being stressed out. I wake up in the morning, I'm like minus 10, right? But there's another part of them that's like, oh, I'm afraid to change. And most of the time, that part that's afraid to change wins. And you're like, no, don't let that part win. It's trying to help you, but it's not helping you in the right way. That part that feels drudgery and miserable and overwhelmed and stressed out, you need to do something about that. Read a book, see Andra, go to the library, whatever. There's ways out of this that you don't have to be like that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. The parts, and I know many people who are very well educated and experienced in this. It's called parts work, and they do
Yeah, that's it. Yeah,
all
yeah.
kinds of
So,
different
and then
exercises and yeah.
the last room of the happy place is what I call CASH. So CASH is an acronym that I made up, and it stands for being connected, being accepted,
Mm-hmm.
being safe, and having hope. So when you
Mm.
put all those rooms together, what a nice place that is, right? And you have control over it. You get to figure out how to get in there. It's not it's I think we were meant to be there. So then what keeps us from there is all the stresses and we can do something about those. So then you get to spend all your time in your happy place, whatever that may be.
Yeah, awesome. I tap a lot into the work of Eckhart Tolle. I think I'm not sure how to pronounce it. He wrote the book The Power of Now, and then the New Earth, and books like that. The Power of Now, very, very powerful book for me, for anxiety, for stress, for being present, and for being in a happy place, like you kind of described. And I really,
Yeah.
really, I'm gonna highlight that again. Instead of just thinking, I want to have less stress, go towards, I want to live in my happy place. Have that positive intention over there as well. Know what you want rather than just what you don't want. And I think that's very powerful, and I see that all
No,
the time, that like kind
I'm
of
writing that
naturally.
down. I think that's an awesome. Yeah,
And I
because
think
that's
that,
exactly that's what I'm talking about, but you said it very succinctly. So,
yeah, awesome. I think it very much impacts even just what your brain will focus on, right? And I love this
yes, that's
story.
exactly.
It didn't talk about specifically stress, but more so just life in general. Even like, for example, when somebody comes to me and they're like, hey, I need help with procrastination, I'm like, okay, well, what are you procrastinating from, right? Like, what is the opposite? What do you want, instead of just like, I want to stop procrastinating? If you don't know what you don't want to, like, there's no way that you can solve it. But I heard this amazing story that really describes this very well. And I'm just going to paraphrase this very quickly. So th- there's a sport called whitewater rafting, right? And obviously it's like very, very fast water. And there's this instructor who has like 20 years of experience. And so these group of dads took their kids to go whitewater rafting. And 3 days in a row, it rained really heavily. So the water was like really, really
Yeah.
big, right? And they get to this place, and the instructor says, "All right, so it's very wild. Out of On a scale from 1 to 5, the rapids are at a 5, like the most that they can be, right? So it can be very dangerous out there. But don't worry, I know exactly what we can do, and we'll be gonna be completely fine, right? So because there's like fallen trees and rocks as they go down the river, and they have to avoid those rocks. And the instructor said, for the first about 5, maybe 7 years of my career, I would do it. I would guide people of like, hey, by the way, be careful. There's a rock over there, and or there's a tree over there, and everybody would focus on the tree, and they would just like
Yeah.
go and crash into the tree. So what he started doing
Hmm.
like after 7 years, instead of being like, get careful, guys, there's a tree, he said, I'm gonna have my finger and I'm just gonna point to the clearing, and I want you to paddle as much as you can towards that clearing. Don't even focus on the tree, and we're going to be completely fine. So when
Yeah.
people would focus on, oh, I don't want to go here, I'm going to crash, they would crash. But if they focus on, I want to go here, this is the clearing, that's where they would end up, and they would be completely fine. And I think with stress or with anxiety or with starting a business or with failing in anything, it can be exactly the same thing. Like, focus on exactly where you want to go, and you're much more likely to succeed and to find your place there. If you focus on, I want to live in my happy place, you're going to end up living more in your happy place. If you focus on, oh my God, so much stress, I don't want to stress so much, you're just going to be more stressed out.
Yeah. No, that's perfect. That's an awesome story. Yeah, that's a very good way to put it. I like that.
Yeah, I
I
heard
wrote
this
that down.
early on. I'm not sure who was the first person whoever told this. I think it's a story passed down because it's very good at
Hmm.
illustrating it. But I heard it personally from Dean Graziosi, I believe. And yeah, this has been an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time. It An hour went by super fast. I'm super
I
super
know,
happy
right?
about this. Even with the couple, or even with the little hiccup with the connection, sometimes that happens. Thank you for sticking through. Who should be reaching out? Who should be somebody to contact you or get your book?
Yeah. So the book is Highway to Your Happy Place, Roadmap to Less Stress. And there's a second book that I got involved with called Mindset Matters. Those are both good books, and they're both on Amazon and Barnes and Noble. Uh, I have a website called thelessstressdoc.com, and you get on there and you can get in contact with me, or my email is lessstressdoc@gmail.com. So reach out if you have questions, if you have problems, let me know, because I'm here to help you, because I don't want people to resign themselves to living their life stressed out. It doesn't have to be like that. We can all be in our happy place. I think we're all meant to be in our happy place. So
Mm,
yeah, and I'm getting ready to write a couple. I have a couple more books in my head. One of the other avenues of this is when people are stressed out, they do something to reduce their stress. But if they do too much of it or start causing problems, then they end up what I call a loop. So I call it a stress reducer loop. And that's the
mm,
term I want to use instead of addiction. So if someone
mm.
goes to work and have a bad day and they go home, they go on their way home, they stop and get a couple beers to reduce their stress. And you're like, well, that's great. But then as they drive home, they get a DUI. And you're like, so the stress, the thing you did to reduce your stress just caused stress. So
Most.
then they get
Ooh.
home and they're telling their spouse that they just got a DUI and they're going to go to a couple beers because they're so stressed out. And they're like, you just got a DUI. Huh? So when the stress reducer starts causing stress, it puts you in a loop. And then that loop
Mm.
just becomes a self fulfilling
Wow.
prophecy and keeps getting you into trouble. Because the more stress, the more you do it, the more you do it, the more stress. So the way out is to get less stress. And our treatment for addiction isn't about having less stress. It's
Yeah.
about control. And it's like that's not the right answer. So
Wow.
one of the offshoots of this is a whole different way to look at addictions.
That's amazing. So is that gonna be your next book?
Yeah, well, so I'm probably writing two books simultaneously. So one is
Okay.
Highway to Your Happy Place, mile marker two, and then there'll be a mile marker three and a mile marker four. And then
Okay.
the other book is going to be called New Outcomes. And the idea is like we
Mm.
need a new term, because addiction, if I say to somebody they're an addict, nobody likes that. You don't put that on your resume and say, oh, hire me because I'm an addict, right? And what I realized, I was like, the reason it's so stigmatized is because people put themselves, they elevate themselves above the addict. Like I see this in the healthcare profession all the time. The healthcare professional is up on a platform and the addict is down below. And you're looking
Mm.
down on them going, you need to make a better choices. You're stupid. You're weak willed. You're genetically defective. You have a personality disorder. And if you would just fix yourself, then you wouldn't have this problem. And I'm up here because I know what I'm talking about. And you're like, wait, what? That puts people in a very unequal situation and it doesn't fix the problem. So in my model, the stress reducer loop model, so it turns out anybody can end up in a stress reducer loop. And anything that you do to reduce your stress can turn into a loop.
Mm.
So my patient came in who had heroin loop, and she's like, oh, when she heard the story, she's like, oh, well, yeah, my sister has a loop. And I'm like, well, okay, what loop does she have? She goes, she's a shopping loop. I'm like, okay, what does that mean? She goes, when she's stressed out, she goes shopping. But now her closets are full, her credit cards are maxed out, her husband gives her a hard time, and then she's stressed out. So what does she do? She goes back and goes shopping. And you're like, yes, that's exactly what I'm talking about. So literally anything can turn into a stress reducer loop, and anybody can be in one. And so then the stigma goes away because we're all at risk for turning into stress reducer loops. And we all
Mm.
have too much stress. And so the way to get out of a stress reducer loop is to say, here's how to have less stress. And then here's something else you can do when you have stress that doesn't have the same side effects. And that way, so then that led me to doing things like learning how to do hypnosis with neurolinguistic programming and
Mhm.
EMDR and reading
Mhm.
integrated family systems. And I read this book, The Body Keeps Score. I don't know if you've read that one or not, but
Yes,
it's freaking
I've
awesome.
heard.
It talks about
I've
how we handle trauma. And
yeah,
what I felt was that if I looked at somebody who looks like they don't have really much stress right now, like right in their life right this moment, I'm like, wait, why is this person so stressed out? And then yeah, oh yeah, well I was raped by a policeman when I was 12, and you're like, oh, well yeah, that would be a problem. So literally 80% of the stress is coming from the past. So you
yeah,
needed to figure out how they handled that situation, and you had to figure out a tool to help them get around that, so they weren't wasting 80% of their coping skills on something that happened in the past. Yeah. And that had, so in my office, I was doing Suboxone and I had 100 patients and I had a 95% success rate. And that was seeing them once a week and giving them a prescription and talking to them. And one of the reasons I was so successful is because people wanted to come and see me. They weren't like, oh, I gotta go see Dr. Sprouse and get my prescription. He's gonna talk down to me. He's gonna be mean to me. He's gonna disrespect. No, they like coming because I said, you know what? You're a normal person. Nobody had ever told them they were normal. I'm like, yes, you're normal. You have stresses. You found something that worked, but then it started causing problems, and you were like, whoa, I got to stop this. But you got stuck because of where your brain was set up. And
hmm
you're like, oh, well, here's a way to get out of it. Oh, this is awesome. Thank you so much. Right. Yeah. So they like coming, and because of the techniques that we were using, we were reducing their stress. So life was easier. They didn't need that other stuff. It was great.
yeah. I think a lot of it, especially in today's world, everything is so stress inducing, and so everything is so high pressure and fast, going in here and going there. So yeah, stress reducer loop, you called it, right? That's an amazing
Yeah, that's it.
term.
That's the new term. Keep that in mind. Okay.
Stress reducer loop instead of addiction. Okay, I like that. I
Yeah.
like that. And
He got
yeah,
me in
so
trouble one night. We went
mhm.
out to dinner with a there was a doctor who was
Okay,
giving a talk about it. We need to go. I'm sorry. I don't. I'm just chatting away.
finish up the story. Now you got me curious. If you can make it fast.
Right. So we go to this dinner, and this doctor's giving a talk about why addictions are a chronic disease. And she goes, "Does anybody here think
Mm.
they're not a disease?" And of course, I raised my hand, and she's like, "Wait, what?" Well, finish your talk. We'll talk later. So she went on about how it's a chronic disease. So she goes, "Why do you think it's a chronic disease? Why do you not think it's a chronic disease?" And I go, "Well, based on your criteria for a disease, then marriage is a disease." And she's like, "What?" And I go, well, yeah, because people are really excited about getting married. They're saying, I'm going to spend the rest of my life with you. And then they start getting into trouble, and there's certain side effects of being married, and they get angry with each other, and they miscommunicate. And then if things don't go well, the marriage dies, and they get divorced. And then they relapse and get married again. And she's like, what? She goes, well, it's not genetic. I go, well, like my mom and dad both got married, all my brothers and sisters got married. That sounds pretty genetic to me. And she's like, and the lady, you could see she's getting frustrated. And my wife elbows me in the side and is like, shut up and eat your dinner. Yeah. But I'm
Yeah.
like, yeah, marriage is a disease, right? If you use the criteria that we use for addiction being a disease. So like I
Mm.
really don't think addiction is a disease. And I think calling it a disease has done us a disservice, and it's made it more difficult for patients to accept that they have an issue. When I say
Yes.
to them, look, you're just stressed out and the thing you're doing to reduce your stress isn't working, then they go, oh, okay. When I say to them, you have a disease that you're going to have for the rest of your life, yeah, nobody wants that.
No, absolutely, right? And it's so disempowering. Like that's the problem that I see with a lot in the mental health space. Like this is right up my alley. This is my little rant. But when people say depression is a chemical imbalance, for example, or when people say
Right.
you have autism or ADHD or social anxiety, and we start putting these labels, and if you and especially with like chronic, right? Like something that's chronic, it just sounds like so daunting, and you're just doomed forever. And then people get into learned helplessness.
Yes.
Whereas if
Right.
you call it, like yeah, it's a stress reducer loop. You can just change the way you reduce your stress, and you're gonna get out of it. Oh, okay. Well, now I have a
Yeah.
solution. I have a way out. I don't feel doomed anymore under a
Yes.
chronic disease, right?
That's exactly what they said. Yes. That's why I was being so successful. But here's the problem I got into. One of my stresses, my board didn't like what I was doing. So they took my prescribing license away. so I
Wow.
couldn't do it anymore. And you're like, wait, what?
Wow.
I said I'm getting a 95% success rate. Like, yeah, we don't like
Wow.
what you're doing. So yeah, so they took my license away. Not my
Wow.
medical license, my ability to prescribe Suboxone they took away. And you're like, okay, that's okay. But somewhere in the
That
future, I'll
is
be
wild.
vindicated.
That is wild. But I think, yeah, I think I would say, especially as a young person, and I've seen this kind of, I've studied some of this. It's like these new ways, and is always kind of like you're called crazy until you're called a genius, right? Like people
Yeah,
scream at people
There you go.
scream at you, and like they fight for the old way until people are, oh, okay, well this person was actually right. But a lot of people, they just get stuck in the old way, and they
Yes,
don't
exactly.
want to let it go for a bunch of different reasons.
No, but you
Um,
are absolutely right when you said we keep calling depression a chemical imbalance, and I'm like, no, that doesn't even make sense. What I found was, and I wrote this in my book. I actually wrote that line in my book. Like what I found was that 90% of patients who we get labeled as depression are really overwhelmed. So the medicine makes them feel better, but it doesn't fix their problems that made them overwhelmed. And so then they just come back again later on when things get worse again, and then you have to add more medicine and different medicine, and now we're adding more expensive medicines, and you're like, and it's not fixing the underlying problem, which is they're just overwhelmed. And
yeah,
so when you say to someone, look, you're overwhelmed, and here's ways to get less overwhelmed, wow, the same thing. They're much more empowered versus I got to take a medicine the rest of my life. I don't want to do that. Yeah,
yeah. And then,
so
of course, we have people who have been taking the medicine for 20 years and it didn't make any difference. And I get to deal with a lot
that's
of
tough.
those.
Huh?
I get
Well,
to
here's what I
share
say.
a lot of those
Like
stories.
theoretically, we're all alcohol deficient, right? Because if I take alcohol, if I drink alcohol, dude, my depression goes away. I'm all excited. My inhibitions are down. I'm enjoying life. I'm dancing on the table. The problem is we don't use the right dose. Like people drink too much of it, and then they get into trouble, right? And it doesn't last long enough, right? So it's like,
Yeah,
would you say you're alcohol deficient because you're less depressed when you're on alcohol? No, that doesn't even make sense. So why am I saying I'm serotonin deficient when I can't even measure serotonin in your brain? It doesn't even make sense.
yeah, yeah.
Anyway,
Well, anyways, this has been an amazing conversation, and I would love to stay in touch and maybe follow up on this. Maybe once
yeah, we need to.
your other books
Yeah, because it sounds like you're
are
doing good work where
released.
you're at. So that's awesome.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah, I've done this for a while, and I love your perspectives. I love your beliefs. I love your values as well. Sounds like you're doing really amazing things. And yeah, I will be probably getting your book as well, or at least recommending it to people, because
Absolutely, do
I
it.
do get to deal with a lot of people who have stress and anxiety, right? And anxiety is just stress on steroids in a way,
Well, do me a
a lot of
favor.
the times.
If you get the book and read it, let me know what you think. Because, like, I'm too close to it. So sometimes, when I'm writing it, I'm
Yeah.
thinking I get that I'm writing it so everybody can understand. And like, what I'm realizing is I have a lot of background knowledge that other people don't have. So things that I take for
Hmm.
granted, they don't. So
Yeah. Yeah. All right.
cool,
And so yeah,
dude. This has been
well,
awesome.
that's it. It's been a very fun and I think very informative, very important conversation to put out there. And yeah, definitely stay in touch. Maybe do this again for in a couple months.
Absolutely, yeah. I was just gonna say we need to do this some more. So
All right.
I'm really
Thank you
enjoying
very
our
much.
conversation.
All
All
right.
right, and
Well,
hopefully
thank you
your
very
audience
much.
got something out of this. All right, man. Talk
Yes.
to you later.
Bye bye.